A struggling single dad helped a woman fix her Mustang. She secretly owned a billion-dollar empire. The scent of motor oil and steel clung to the walls of Miller's auto shop like a permanent memory. In the small town of Glenridge, Texas, where the streets were wide and the dreams were narrow, Jackson Miller was already hard at work by 7 o'clock in the morning, sleeves rolled up, sweat gathering along his brow. He wasn't just fixing cars, he was keeping his life from collapsing entirely. 3 years had passed since cancer took Hannah, his wife, and the love of his life, leaving him with their daughter Ellie, who was only 6 at the time. Now 9 years old, Ellie had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. Every morning she tied her shoes in silence at the breakfast table, watching her father pack a lukewarm sandwich and a fading hope into his lunchbox. The auto shop had once thrived, especially when Jackson and Hannah had run it together. She had handled the books, the customers, and the occasional rusted pickup with a seized engine. Now, Jackson did it all. His hands bore the evidence of long days and longer nights, scraped knuckles, blackened fingernails, calluses layered like armor. Still, the bills piled higher than the wrenches in his toolbox. The letter from the bank had arrived a week ago, stamped in red. 30 days until foreclosure on the shop. 30 days until he would lose not only his business, but the last part of Hannah that still felt alive in this world. He hadn't told Ellie. She didn't need to carry that weight. Not yet. Every evening he tucked her in with a story she no longer believed in. A story of things getting better, of a miracle job or a surprise that would make the world right again. And every night after her breathing slowed into sleep, he sat at the kitchen table staring at numbers that refused to add up. "Morning, Jack," called Mrs. Redford, the elderly widow who still brought her '97 Buick in twice a month, whether it needed anything or not. She represented the last loyal customers who believed in him, who remembered the way he had once smiled more easily. "Morning, ma'am," he replied with a tired grin, wiping grease on a rag and pushing his doubts aside. There were cars to fix. Maybe today would bring something better. By noon, the sun blazed high over the metal roofs of the town. Jackson paused only to drink water from the battered cooler outside the garage. His mind never really rested. Thoughts circled like vultures. How to keep the lights on, how to pay for Ellie's school supplies, how to fix a life that seemed beyond repair. But he never showed it. Not to Ellie, not to anyone. His grief lived quietly in the spaces between, spark plugs and muffler brackets. That afternoon, Ellie showed up at the shop after school, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders, her ponytail frizzed from the heat. She plopped onto the stool near the workbench, pulling out a worn notebook filled with half-solved math problems. "Hey, sweet pea," Jackson said, his voice softening as it always did for her. "How was school?" "Okay. Mrs. Thompson says I need to practice fractions more." "Well," he chuckled, "I could use a fraction of a break, so maybe..." "You're doing better than me," she smiled. That was enough. A moment of light in the dim workshop. Just as the sun began to dip behind the grain silos west of town, a sound cut through the usual rhythm of the day. A sharp engine pop, followed by a sputter and a metallic rattle. A car, clearly struggling, coasted down the road and came to a halt in front of the shop. Jackson wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped out. That was when he saw the Mustang, a vintage model, candy apple red, with curves that spoke of another era. But it was the woman behind the wheel that caught his attention. She stepped out slowly, as if unused to the uneven gravel under her heels. Tall, poised, with a grace that felt imported from somewhere far away. Jackson's brows furrowed slightly. Tourists were rare, strangers were rarer. The woman glanced around, shielding her eyes from the sun with a manicured hand. She looked at the shop sign, then at Jackson, then at the engine as if trying to diagnose it herself. "Looks like she's overheated," Jackson called out already, walking toward the car. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I was hoping to make it a few more miles." Her voice was smooth, composed. There was something about it that didn't match the setting, like jazz playing in a country bar. "Pop the hood," he said gently. She did, and he leaned over the engine, inspecting the tangle of hoses and belts. "You're lucky you didn't fry the whole block," he muttered. Then louder, "Need to stay overnight, though. I can take a look. Might..." The woman hesitated. "That's fine. I'll figure something out. You're passing through?" Something like that. He glanced at her again, this time catching the faint outline of something hard beneath her calm. Sadness, maybe, or secrets. "Well," he said finally, "I'll do what I can. Name's Jackson." "Claire," she replied. Their hands met briefly, and for a moment the noise of the world fell away. The sound of the Mustang sputtering into the gravel driveway was unlike anything Jackson had heard that day. A mechanical cough wrapped in a classic rumble. It rolled up with an awkward grace, its polished red exterior already turning dusty under the Texas sun. The engine stuttered one last time before going silent, as if the car itself was sighing in relief. Jackson glanced up from under the hood of an old Ford truck and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. A woman stepped out of the driver's seat, pausing just before her shoes hit the ground. Her presence was striking, not in an ostentatious way, but because everything about her felt completely out of place. She wore a light linen blouse, tailored slacks, and shoes that didn't belong anywhere near engine oil or cracked pavement. Her hair was tied in a low, loose bun, and her sunglasses caught the sunlight like shards of glass. She looked around, slowly, uncertain but composed. Jackson set down his wrench and walked toward her, careful not to make assumptions too quickly. "Engine trouble?" he asked, stopping a few feet from the car. Something started knocking about 10 miles back. Then the temperature gauge spiked. "I thought I could make it to the next town, but..." She looked at the garage, then at him. "Here I am." "Well, you're lucky you made it at all," Jackson said, crouching down to inspect the front grille. "Classic model like this doesn't give you much forgiveness." "I figured," she replied. "Can you take a look?" "Sure thing." "Pop the hood." She stepped back to pull the latch, and the hood rose with a groan. Jackson leaned in, inspecting the maze of hoses and the aged yet pristine engine. He could tell she'd taken care of it, even if she hadn't driven far. "Overheated," he muttered. "Coolant's low, fan belt's not in great shape either. You try to push this much farther, and you'd have melted the whole block." The woman didn't flinch. She stood with her arms crossed, watching him as if she were measuring more than just his mechanical skill. "How long do you think it'll take?" Jackson closed the hood gently. "Could be a couple of days, might need to order parts. This year of Mustang, 68 I'm guessing, doesn't come with easy fixes." "I can wait," she said simply. "Passing through?" She hesitated. "Something like that." Jackson nodded. He wasn't the kind to ask more questions than necessary, but her vagueness stuck in his mind. People didn't usually pass through Glenridge. It was the kind of town you either belonged to or got lost in. "Name's Jackson Miller," he said, extending his hand. She accepted it with a firm grip. "Claire Bennett." He held her gaze for a moment. There was something behind her eyes, not fear, but distance, like a part of her wasn't really standing there at all. "You can leave the car here," he continued. "I'll do a full check and let you know what needs fixing. There's a diner 2 blocks down if you're hungry, and a small motel just past that." "Thanks," she said, stepping back. "I'll check in." As she walked away, her steps slow and deliberate, Jackson watched the dust rise behind. Her Ellie peeked out from behind a stack of tires. "Who was that?" she asked. "Someone with a broken car," Jackson replied, picking up his wrench again. "She's not from here." "Nope. She looks like the people on the magazine covers at the dentist's office." Jackson chuckled. "She's just a traveler, sweet pea. Nothing more." But even as he said it, something about Claire Bennett lingered in the air. Not just her perfume, which smelled faintly of citrus and leather, but her entire presence. She didn't act like someone stranded. There was calm in her, a patience too rehearsed to be accidental. The next morning, Jackson arrived early to get ahead on the truck repairs, only to find Claire already there, leaning against the wall near the entrance with a coffee in hand. She wore jeans and a plain shirt this time, her hair pulled back tighter, her expression softer. "Didn't expect to see you this early," he said. "Didn't sleep much," she admitted. "Thought I'd get a head start on the day." "You're welcome to sit inside, it's cooler. I prefer the air." Throughout the day, Claire wandered the town on foot. She visited the diner, then the antique store. and even helped Ellie with her math homework when the girl got frustrated trying to calculate percentages. Jackson watched all of it from the shop windows. Claire was a stranger, and yet she moved, like someone trying to become familiar, not with the town but with something quieter and internal. By the end of the second day, she hadn't asked once about the car. That, more than anything, told Jackson she wasn't in a rush. That evening, he found her sitting on a bench outside the motel. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the pavement. "Hope the room's treating you okay," he said. "It's simple, I like it." Claire looked up at the sky. "Your daughter is smart, sharp, but kind. She gets that from her mum. Where is she?" Jackson took a breath. "She passed. Cancer. 3 years ago." Claire nodded. "I'm sorry." "Thanks." Silence settled again. Not the awkward kind, but something gentler. Shared. Claire traced her finger along the bench edge, then said quietly, "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" Jackson smiled faintly. "If it's falling apart." "Used to, but now, this is what I have. This shop, Ellie, it's home." Even Claire looked at him then, really looked, grounded. "You're lucky to have something that keeps you, maybe," he said. "Or maybe I'm just too tired to try anything else." She smiled, but there was no joy in it, just understanding. The following day, Claire brought Jackson a sandwich from the diner. She didn't ask if he was hungry. She just handed it to him and sat down beside the open hood of the Mustang. "It's funny," she said, watching him work. "I came here expecting nothing, just space. And you found an old mechanic in a broken town. I found something real." Jackson didn't look up, but he heard the weight in her words. She wasn't just talking about the place. By the 4th day, the car was still untouched. The part he'd ordered hadn't arrived, and neither of them seemed particularly concerned. Claire kept showing up. Ellie kept asking her questions. And Jackson, for the first time in a long while, didn't feel alone in his struggle. Something had changed. The car had brought her there, but it was no longer the reason she stayed. 3 days had passed since Claire Bennett's arrival in Glenridge, and what began as a routine vehicle repair had slowly turned into something far less ordinary. The Mustang, its hood still open and engine partially disassembled, remained untouched since Jackson's initial assessment. The necessary part, a rare component he had to request from a supplier in San Antonio, was still in transit. Yet even with her car sitting idle and nothing pressing keeping her there, Claire hadn't left. She continued to start her days early, often beating Jackson to the shop. He would find her seated outside the garage, sipping black coffee, legs crossed, reading from a worn paperback or simply watching the world stir awake. Claire had a way of fitting into the backdrop without actually blending in. She was still too refined, too deliberately composed, but she no longer looked misplaced. Glenridge wasn't the sort of town that changed much. Faces were familiar, stories repeated themselves across generations, and news traveled faster than delivery trucks. So when a mysterious woman with a classic car and polished demeanor started frequenting local spots, the diner, the park bench, outside the hardware store, the school's library where Ellie often went after class, people noticed. But instead of questioning her, they accepted her presence with the slow warmth the town was known for. Ruth, the diner owner, began calling her Hon by the second morning. The postman tipped his hat. Even old George, who hadn't trusted, a new face since the 90s, offered her a nod of acknowledgement. What puzzled Jackson most was how easily Claire connected with Ellie. His daughter, shy around strangers since Hannah's passing, had become unexpectedly talkative in Claire's company. They spent afternoons together in the garage office, Ellie showing off drawings and homework, Claire listening attentively, asking just the right questions without any of the condescension that adults often unconsciously placed on children. One afternoon, Ellie asked, "Do you have kids?" Claire hesitated just slightly. "No, I don't. Would you want some?" "Maybe," Claire answered with a gentle smile. "One like you would be nice." Jackson overheard the exchange from his workspace and felt an unexpected tightening in his chest. He wasn't sure what to make of this bond growing between his daughter and a woman they knew so little about. Still, Claire's kindness seemed genuine. She never overstepped, never forced herself into anything. She simply existed in their space, quietly, gracefully, as if she belonged there all along. That evening, Jackson found himself sitting beside Claire on the wooden steps of the shop, the sunset painting everything in shades of gold and red. Ellie had gone home with her neighbor, and the air was thick with the scent of oil, dust, and cooling engines. "Do you ever fix a car yourself?" Jackson asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Never," Claire said, "but I watched my father work on his when I was little. He used to restore vintage cars on the weekends, said it reminded him of a time when machines were honest." Jackson chuckled. "Sounds like a man I could have shared a beer with." Claire looked out toward the quiet road. He was complicated, brilliant but distant, the kind of person who was always moving even when standing still. "Sounds exhausting." "It was," she admitted, to me. And then it wasn't, because one day he just stopped, left everything. There was weight in her words, but Jackson didn't press. Whatever Claire was running from, she wasn't ready to face it just yet, and he wasn't the kind to pry into someone else's ghosts. As the part for the Mustang remained delayed, Claire grew even more embedded in their lives. She brought meals to the garage, helped reorganize old paperwork that had been piling up in Jackson's office, even offered to run errands, claiming she needed the walk. Jackson had to admit, the place hadn't felt this alive in years. But with the comfort came an uneasiness he couldn't name. She was too poised, too composed. Every answer she gave seemed practiced, every smile carefully curated. And while she offered small pieces of herself, they felt filtered, like reading a story through a glass window. Then, one morning, Claire showed up in faded jeans and a loose plaid shirt, her hair tied back with no trace of makeup. She carried a toolbox awkwardly but proudly and announced, "I want to help today." Jackson arched a brow. "You know what's in that box?" "Not a clue," she said, "but I can learn." He handed her a cloth and showed her how to wipe down the engine parts before reassembly. She followed instructions closely, hands steady despite her inexperience. There was something about seeing her like this, stripped of the polish, sleeves, rolled up, brow furrowed in concentration, that caught Jackson off guard. It wasn't attraction, at least not entirely. It was recognition. He saw someone trying, genuinely trying, to be present, to earn a place she hadn't asked for. They worked side by side that afternoon. At one point, Jackson looked up and found Claire watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What?" he asked. She shook her head, smiling. "Nothing. You just remind me of something I didn't know I missed." He wanted to ask what that was, but something held him back. That night, after dinner, Ellie crawled onto Jackson's lap, her arms wrapping around his neck. "Do you think Claire will leave soon?" He paused. "I don't know." "I hope she doesn't," Ellie whispered. "She listens." Jackson tightened his arms around her, unsure whether the ache in his chest came from his daughter's words or the truth buried inside them. By the fifth day, the Mustang's replacement part finally arrived. Jackson could have installed it that same evening, but something made him wait. Claire hadn't asked about the car since the first morning. It was as though the Mustang, once her prized possession, had become irrelevant. Or perhaps it had served its purpose in bringing her to a place she didn't know she needed. That evening, just before locking up, Jackson walked over to where Claire was seated with Ellie, helping her solve a math problem. "Part came in," he said. Claire looked up. "So the car's ready? Could be by tomorrow." She didn't smile, didn't frown either. Good to know. But she didn't ask him to finish it, and he didn't offer to. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that the vehicle that brought her here wasn't the only thing in need of repair. The sun rose behind a curtain of thick clouds, casting a pale grey light over Glenridge that mirrored Jackson's mood almost perfectly. It was a Wednesday, but days no longer carried weight. Each one bled into the next in a cycle of labor, worry, and a barely maintained sense of normalcy. The morning began like so many others. The clang of metal, the hiss of a compressor, the faint laughter of Ellie echoing from the corner of the garage where she scribbled away in her notebook. Claire brought coffee again, without a word, placing the cup beside him as he worked under the hood of a dusty Dodge. Then the mail arrived. Jackson didn't open the envelope immediately. It sat on the edge of his workbench, unassuming and plain, bearing only the bank's name and a sequence of numbers he'd memorized far too well. But the moment he finally tore the seal and read the first line, the breath left his chest like he'd been punched. There was no delay, no mercy in the phrasing. Foreclosure proceedings would begin within the month. 26 days. That was all the time he had left before the property, his garage, his livelihood was gone. He sat down, the letter still in his hand, as the noise of the shop faded into a dull hum around him. For a long while, he said nothing, just stared at the numbers on the page, at the precise, emotionless formatting of the words. This building had belonged to his father before him. He and Hannah had rebuilt it together, shaping it into something more than just a workplace. It was memory. It was permanence. And now it was slipping away line by legal line. Claire noticed immediately. She approached slowly, concern etched across her face. Bad news. He didn't look up. The worst kind. She didn't ask to see the letter. Instead, she sat beside him and waited. "I've got less than a month," he finally said. "Then this place is gone." Claire was quiet. Her fingers curled slightly against her knee, betraying her instinct to step in, to fix it, to offer something more than silence. But she stopped herself. She understood enough about Jackson now to know he wouldn't accept help easily. Not from anyone, especially not from someone like her. "What are you going to do?" she asked after a moment. "I don't know," he answered. "Sell the tools, maybe. Raise what I can." "But that would shut down the shop." "I know." He stood, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into his back pocket. Claire watched him move around the garage, collecting his thoughts piece by piece as if they were scattered tools needing to be put away. Later that day, Jackson visited the local pawn shop. He didn't take anything with him, just looked around, weighing options. He asked about prices for equipment similar to his, trying not to wince at the numbers he heard. They were far too low, a cruel mismatch between the value of his tools and what the world was willing to pay for them. Still, it was the only plan he had. When he returned, Claire was waiting with lunch in a paper bag. They sat together on the bench outside the shop. She handed him a sandwich and waited. "You went to ask about selling," she said quietly. He didn't bother pretending. "Yeah." Claire took a slow sip of water, then set the bottle down beside her. Trapped, to think there's no one to turn to. "I know what it's like to feel." Jackson glanced at her, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were on the horizon. "Sometimes we make sacrifices to keep going," she continued. "But the hardest ones are when you have to give up a piece of yourself. This place, well, it's not just a business, is it?" "No, it's everything." She finally looked at him. "Then don't sell it. Not unless you absolutely have to." "What choice do I have?" "There's always another way." Jackson didn't respond. He appreciated her presence, the calm strength she carried, but he couldn't afford to believe in maybes. He had a daughter to care for and no safety net. Hope wasn't something he could risk anymore. That evening, after closing the shop and dropping Ellie off at a friend's for the night, Jackson returned to the garage alone. The building was quiet, the smell of grease and metal lingering like a familiar ghost. He walked the aisles of tools and parts, running his fingers along the benches, stopping at the old pegboard where he'd once hung a sign reading "Miller and Family Auto." He took it down without thinking, set it aside, then stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space it left behind. By the time Claire found him, it was nearly 9 o'clock. She didn't ask why he was still there. She simply sat beside him, letting the quiet stretch between them. "I had a meeting like that once," and she said eventually, "a boardroom full of people in suits, telling me how the company would survive without me. I'd given them everything, years of work, strategy, loyalty. But the second they thought I was vulnerable, they started circling." Jackson didn't answer, but his gaze softened. "I walked out, took nothing with me, just the Mustang. I drove until the road ended here. Running away doesn't fix anything," he said. "No, but sometimes standing still gives you a better view of what matters. Claire leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, eyes closed. Jackson watched her, trying to understand what it was about her story that made him want to believe. Again. She was mysterious, yes, and clearly hiding more than she let on, but she was also genuine in a way he couldn't deny. "I don't want Ellie to lose this place," he said, voice low. "It's the only home she remembers." "Then fight for it," Claire said, "even if it means asking for help." He didn't answer, but something in her tone, not pleading but resolute, stuck with him. The next morning he made a list, every tool, machine and part he could possibly part with. He began cleaning items he hadn't touched in years, organizing them by value and function. It was practical, efficient, and brutally painful. Ellie noticed. "Why are you packing everything?" she asked. "I need to sell a few things, sweetheart." "Are we moving?" "No," he said quickly. "At least, I hope not." She stared at him for a moment, then nodded, walking back to her coloring book, but the way she clutched her pencil tighter told him she understood more than he wanted. Her too. As Jackson loaded the first box into his truck, Claire approached with a folded piece of paper. "What's that?" he asked. "Something I drew up. Just an idea." He opened it. Inside was a sketch and a floor plan reimagined. Across the top, "Miller and Bennett Motors," Gus, it read. He looked at her, confused. "I don't expect anything," she said quickly. "Another way together. But if you're willing to trust me, maybe we can find." He held the paper, heart pounding. It was the first time in weeks he'd felt the faint pulse of possibility. He said nothing, but he didn't let go of the sketch. The sound of wind rustling through the tall grass behind the shop was the only thing that filled the silence between Claire and Jackson that evening. The sun had slipped beneath the horizon hours ago, and yet neither of them had made a move to leave. The night air was warm, but carried a weight, the kind of stillness that made every thought feel louder. They sat side by side on a rusted metal bench behind the garage, where customers never went, and where Jackson often sat alone when the world felt too heavy. Tonight, though, Claire was there. She had brought 2 coffees, left untouched for too long. In her hand, she held a photo, not hers, but Jackson's, one she had asked to see earlier in the day. It was a picture of Hannah, smiling wide beside a pickup truck, her arm around a much younger Jackson. Her eyes were bright, alive, in a way only captured in fleeting moments. She looked like someone who believed in everything, Claire said, her voice soft but certain. "She did," Jackson replied. "Sense. And she made you believe in it too." Even when it didn't make, Claire kept staring at the image, as if trying to memorize the lines of Hannah's face. "You miss her every day?" "Some days. It feels like yesterday, others like a lifetime ago, but yeah, every day." The silence returned, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was a space they both seemed to understand. After a moment, Claire folded the photo gently and handed it back. "I lost someone too," she said, staring ahead now. "But it wasn't the same. It was sudden, violent in the way it interrupted everything." Jackson didn't ask who. He waited. "My father," she continued. "We weren't close the way people imagine. He was larger than life, powerful, intelligent, meticulous, the kind of man who walked into a room and changed the temperature." Jackson nodded. He knew that type. He'd worked for men like that in his younger years. They were magnets and storms all at once. When he died, everything came crashing down. I inherited more than a company. I inherited enemies, expectations, lies I hadn't seen coming. Claire's voice tightened slightly. "Turns out, he wasn't just building a business. He was building an empire. And empires draw vultures. People I'd trusted my whole life began circling, waiting for me to fail. Some even helped push me toward it." She leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, eyes fixed on the gravel beneath her feet. "Tried to fight. At first. Meetings, strategy sessions, public appearances. I played the part, but inside, I was unraveling. I didn't know who I was without his shadow. I didn't know if the person they expected me to be even existed." Jackson stayed quiet. He didn't need to say anything. Everything in his body language said he was listening. "So I left. No one knew, no security. No driver. I took the Mustang, his Mustangs, and disappeared. She smiled faintly at the memory, though there was little joy in it. I told myself I just needed a week, maybe 2. But then days turned to months, and when I found this place, it was the first time I'd felt quiet. Jackson looked at her then. Really looked. She had always carried herself with elegance, but beneath that there was something fractured. Not broken exactly, but reshaped by pain. You chose not to tell anyone, he said finally. Claire nodded. Because if they found me, it would be over. I'd be dragged back whether I was ready or not. I needed to know if I could exist outside of that world, if I could just be me. And what did you find? She hesitated, still figuring that out. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of a town asleep. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then went quiet. The crickets picked up where it left off. Jackson leaned back, hands behind his head. Got here. You know, I never asked what you did before you. I know, that's why I stayed. He turned toward her, puzzled. You didn't treat me like I was fragile or suspicious. You treated me like a person, just a woman with a broken car. That's all I saw, he said. Claire smiled, but this time it reached her eyes. The next morning, everything felt slightly different. Claire still arrived early, but instead of her usual quiet calm, there was a new tension in her shoulders. Ellie noticed it first. Are you okay? The girl asked, pausing in the middle of a drawing. Claire nodded quickly. Just tired. But Jackson knew better. She was thinking about the night before, about the line she had crossed by telling her story. Vulnerability had a way of leaving a person raw the next day. Still, the rhythm of the shop continued. Claire helped clean up the back room, sorting bolts and washers into labeled jars. Ellie tagged along behind her, mimicking everything. She did. Jackson watched the two of them from his workbench, and for a moment it almost felt like a life he could imagine. A life with them in it. Later that afternoon, Claire found him adjusting the timing on a rebuilt engine. She waited until he looked up. Do you regret telling me about Hannah? He shook his head. No. You. Claire didn't answer right away. It'd feel more real. No, she said at last. But it's strange. Saying it out loud makes... Sometimes we need that. She nodded, then quieter. Sometimes I wish I could go back. Not to change anything. Just to understand it better. To see what I missed. You can't, Jackson said. But you can decide what you do with it now. They stood there in the heat of the afternoon, surrounded by grease and steel and the smell of gasoline. And yet in that space, there was something undeniably human. Two people, both carrying more than they showed, finding, perhaps, a place to lay it down if only for a while. The rhythm of Glenridge had grown familiar, even comforting. The days passed with a dependable flow. The chime of the garage doorbell, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the predictable lull between lunch and the afternoon heat. Jackson found himself moving through this rhythm with more ease now. Claire's presence had become part of the pattern, as natural as oil on his hands or the rasp of an engine turning over. She still hadn't asked when the Mustang would be ready. He hadn't volunteered the information either. The unspoken understanding between them remained intact. She wasn't just here for the car anymore. Then, on a Tuesday that began like any other, a black car pulled into the shop lot. It wasn't a pickup, it wasn't local. It didn't belong. The sedan's paint was glossy, spotless, and its windows tinted to an almost mirror-like sheen. The tires crushed the gravel with an arrogant smoothness, as if the car believed it didn't belong there. Jackson stepped out from beneath the Dodge he'd been working on and narrowed his eyes. Ellie was sitting nearby with her sketch pad. He quietly motioned for her to go inside. She obeyed without a word. Claire was at the back of the shop organizing a shelf. She heard the change in atmosphere before she saw anything. The way the tools stopped clinking, the way Jackson's posture shifted. She stepped into the doorway just as the car door opened. The man who emerged was tall, lean, and sharp in every visible way. His dark suit didn't belong in the heat of Texas, and yet he wore it like armor. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was unmistakably corporate, smooth, cold, and transactional. "Good afternoon," the man said, his tone clipped and precise. "I'm looking for Claire Bennett." Jackson didn't answer immediately. He wiped his hands on a rag and approached slowly. "Depends who's asking." "My name is Marcus Field. I represent business interests tied to Ms. Bennett. We've been trying to locate her for some time. According to GPS data, this is the last known position of her vehicle." Claire stepped forward before Jackson could respond. Her expression didn't betray fear, only exhaustion. "Marcus," she said calmly. The man turned toward her, a flash of something like relief or annoyance crossing his face. "Claire, finally. I'm fine. You can report that back to whoever sent you." "We both know it's not that simple," Marcus replied. "Your prolonged absence has stirred up a situation you cannot ignore. There are board members questioning your leadership. Investors are on edge. The press is sniffing around. I'm not ready to return. You're not in a position to make that decision unilaterally anymore." Claire stood tall. "I absolutely am." The exchange wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a courtroom. Jackson stood by silently, arms crossed, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Every piece of the puzzle he had collected was suddenly rearranged. Marcus took a step closer. "The company is floundering without your presence. If you're not back in your office by the end of the week, they will move to strip your authority." "Let them try," Claire said. "You know very well they can damage more than your position. Your reputation, your legacy, they're already speaking to journalists." Jackson had heard enough. He stepped between them, not interested. "I think that's enough for today." Marcus shifted his gaze. "And you are? This is my garage. She's my guest, and I don't like the tone you brought with you." Marcus gave a thin smile. "Noted." He turned back to Claire. "This doesn't go away, Claire. Whether you're hiding in a motel in the middle of nowhere or sitting behind your desk in a corner office, the weight is still yours." Without another word, he walked back to the car, got in and drove off, leaving only the dust behind. For a moment, neither Jackson nor Claire moved. The air between them was heavy now, charged with truths that could no longer be avoided. "You lied," he said finally, not accusing, just stating a fact. "I never said I wasn't someone else," she replied softly. "I just didn't say who." He walked back into the shop and tossed the rag onto the workbench. "Exactly? CEO, heiress, fugitive? So what are you?" She followed slowly. "Something too big, too fast. I'm someone who needed to breathe, someone who lost control of, and now it's followed you here." Claire sat on the edge of the bench, her posture slightly folded, vulnerable. "I thought I could pause everything. Just stop time long enough to remember who I was before they all decided who I had to be." Jackson leaned against the wall. "And did you?" She looked up at him. "Yes. But now I don't know how to hold on to it." Ellie peeked around, the doorway sensing the shift. Claire smiled at her, and the little girl ran into her arms. "I don't want you to go," Ellie whispered. "I don't want to either," Claire said, "but I might have to." That night, the garage was quieter than usual. Jackson sat alone for a long time after Ellie fell asleep, trying to process what he'd learned. Claire wasn't just a woman running from her past. She was someone at the center of a storm that now knew exactly where to find her. And yet, despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to push her away, not just because of what she meant to Ellie, but because of what she had come to mean to him. The following morning, Claire returned as if nothing had happened. She brought coffee, asked about the Dodge's brakes, and helped Ellie with her math. But Jackson could see the weight in her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted when she thought no one was looking. "Why didn't you leave with him?" he asked quietly. "Because I'm not finished here." And just like that, Jackson knew the fight she had ahead, and the part he might have to play in it. The morning after Marcus Field left town, the air around the garage felt different. It wasn't just tension. It was something deeper, a change in the unspoken rules that had defined Claire's presence in Glenridge. What had once been a quiet escape was now a temporary hiding place exposed. Jackson felt it in every movement she made, in the way her shoulders carried more weight, in how often her eyes drifted toward the front of the shop, expecting another black car to appear at any moment. She never asked Jackson to protect her. She didn't need to. The moment Marcus had turned his cold smile in Claire's direction, something inside Jackson had shifted. He didn't need a full backstory to know what it meant to be hunted by the life you left behind. He'd seen it, before Kyo, in old friends from his younger years who'd tried to escape bad decisions, in customers who came through town looking for a place to start over. But Claire wasn't running from something she did. She was running from a version of herself that had been constructed by others, shaped by money, power, and expectations too heavy for anyone to carry for long. Jackson didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake on the couch with Ellie curled up in her room down the hall, the hum of the ceiling fan keeping company with his thoughts. When the sun rose, he'd already made his decision. That morning, Claire arrived with her usual calm, though Jackson could see right through it. She was checking the inventory list they'd reorganized together, pretending to care about the categorization of nuts and bolts, but her hands trembled slightly when she thought he wasn't watching. "Did you sleep?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Enough." He didn't press. Instead, he pulled off his gloves, walked to the corner of the shop, and unlocked a drawer beneath the old cash register. Inside was a small envelope containing every dollar he had scraped together over the last 3 months. Earnings from odd jobs, spare parts sold, and money he'd saved for Ellie's school supplies. He held it in his hand for a long moment, before setting it on the workbench beside her. Claire looked at it, then at him. "What's this?" "My answer," he said, "to the question you didn't ask." I know," he interrupted gently. "But I see what's happening. You're not just taking a break. You're trying to hold back a world that doesn't let people like you slow down. You came here hoping no one would notice, but now they've found you, and you're thinking maybe it's time to run again." Claire didn't deny it. She looked down at the envelope. "I don't want your money, Jackson. It's not about the money, it's about standing still long enough to fight." She took a breath, then exhaled slowly. "You have no idea what they'll do to me if I fight back. They control the press, the narrative. They've already started twisting it. They'll say I abandoned the company, that I was unstable, selfish. They'll make it sound like I didn't care about any of it." "Then tell your story before they do," he said. "You've spent your whole life building something, haven't you? Don't let them destroy it without even hearing your voice." Claire hesitated, the weight of his words settling over. "If I go back, I lose this place, you, Ellie." "You don't have to go back alone," Jackson said quietly. She looked at him then, truly looked, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't charity or pity, it was conviction. He had made up his mind long before she walked in that morning. Later that day, a call came into the shop. It wasn't a customer, it was Marcus. Jackson recognized his voice instantly, smooth, rehearsed, sterile. "I assume you've had time to speak with Ms. Bennett," he said. "I have." "Good. Then I trust she'll be returning soon." Jackson took a moment before responding. "She's not going anywhere." There was a pause. "I'm sorry." "You heard me. She's not leaving. Not until she decides to. And if you send anyone else here, they'll be dealing with me first." A long silence followed. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Miller." "Maybe, but it's mine to make." He hung up before Marcus could reply. Claire stood nearby, having heard most of the conversation. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stepped closer and placed her hand gently on his arm. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," he said, "because someone has to, and because I trust you." That trust wasn't born out of blind faith. It had been built, quietly, in shared meals, in afternoons spent working side by side, in the way Claire spoke to Ellie as if she were her own. Jackson had seen the truth behind the layers. Claire was capable, strong, but tired of being forced to prove herself in rooms full of wolves. He didn't know the full story, but he knew enough to stand with her. That night, Claire sat at the kitchen table of Jackson's small house, a cup of tea in her hands, a notepad in front of her. She was writing, not for the board or the public, but for herself, notes, thoughts, truths that had never been spoken out loud. Ellie sat nearby, doodling as always. The soft scratch of pencils on paper was the only sound in the room. Jackson watched them both from the hallway. For a fleeting second, he imagined a different life. One not haunted by bank notices or company scandals. Just this, a quiet home, laughter, hands stained with honest work, and a woman who, for once, didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. He stepped into the room and sat beside Claire. She looked at him, her face illuminated by the dim kitchen light. "You sure about this?" she asked. "No," he admitted, "but I'm sure about you." Outside, the wind shifted direction. A storm was coming. Not the kind that shook windows, but the kind that rearranged lives. Jackson had never been one for grand gestures or public stands. But for Claire, and for the fragile peace they'd built together, he was willing to make the riskiest decision of his life. It started with a letter. Not another one from the bank. That threat already hung over Jackson's head like a constant storm cloud. But a medical notice. It arrived folded neatly in Ellie's backpack, a standard update from the school nurse. A few symptoms, easily dismissed on their own: fatigue, light sensitivity, and 2 recent dizzy spells that Ellie hadn't mentioned. Jackson read it twice before calling the clinic. They suggested tests, blood work. Nothing urgent, they said, but enough to warrant further evaluation. The kind of evaluation that came with a price tag Jackson simply couldn't afford. That same afternoon, the bank made good on its promise. A man in a tan suit with a clipboard and a polite but sterile smile stepped into the garage and pinned a notice to the inside wall just below the calendar. 21 days. The shop was officially entering the final phase of foreclosure proceedings. If Jackson didn't make a substantial payment within 3 weeks, the property would be seized. The man left without further comment. Claire watched it all from the far end of the garage, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Jackson said nothing at first. He just stood there, staring at the notice as if reading it hard enough could change the words. His hands were covered in grease. The rag he used to wipe them felt rougher than usual. Claire approached slowly. "Jackson?" He didn't turn to face her. "Ellie's sick," he said. "I need to take her to the clinic for tests." She waited. "What kind of tests?" "They're not sure, but it's enough to scare me." Claire didn't offer comfort, not in the traditional sense. Instead, she did what Jackson had come to recognize as her way of caring. She listened. Her silence wasn't absence. It was presence without intrusion. That night, she made dinner for Ellie, while Jackson called 3 different hospitals trying to compare costs. Each call ended with the same helpless frustration. Even the most basic packages would cost more than what he had saved. He considered asking for help, but stopped himself every time. His pride wasn't arrogance, it was survival. It was the need to be solid for Ellie. The next morning, the storm truly hit. News broke online first. A short article buried in a business section: Heiress CEO still missing amid corporate shakeup. Claire's name was in the headline. The piece didn't accuse her directly, but the implications were sharp. Investors were pulling back. The board was reviewing options. Speculations ranged from a mental breakdown to a secretive overseas affair. None of it was confirmed, but none of it had to be. An hour later, 2 journalists appeared in town. They didn't go to the shop right away. They loitered in the diner, asking questions, showing pictures. Ruth called Jackson, her voice low and urgent. He stepped out back and found Claire already, there staring at her phone with a blank expression. "They're here," he said. She nodded. "I saw." "What do you want to do?" Claire lowered the phone. "Nothing. There's nothing I can say right now that won't be twisted. They'll find the garage, they'll take pictures, they might talk to Ellie." That last part hit harder than it should have. Claire blinked. "Then I'll leave." Jackson took a step closer. "Don't. If I stay, I make it worse for you. For her. You think hiding again fixes it?" She looked at him, and for the first time since they'd met, there was fear in her eyes, not of losing a company or of public disgrace, but of damaging something real, something fragile. "She's the first child who's looked at me like I was more than my name," Claire said. "That'd be ruined. I can't let." Jackson clenched his jaw. "Then stay and fight." But it wasn't that simple. Claire's silence was no longer a shield. It had become ammunition for those trying to push her out. And now, Jackson saw the shape of her dilemma in full. If she spoke, the board would scrutinize every word. If she remained quiet, they'd replace her. And meanwhile, his own world was cracking open. Ellie's health, the foreclosure, the weight of survival pressing down with no mercy. That night, the three of them sat at the dinner table, trying to pretend the walls weren't closing in. Ellie laughed at something on her tablet. Claire smiled, but her hands trembled as she passed the salad. Jackson ate in silence. He couldn't taste anything. His mind was on numbers, deadlines, diagnoses, and decisions he no longer had time to make. Later, after Ellie went to bed, he found Claire in the living room, sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," she whispered. Jackson sat beside her. "Neither do I. I thought I could hold both lives in my hands. Be this version of myself here, and still protect everything I left behind. You can't hold everything. Sometimes you have to let someone else carry part of it." Claire looked at him, and the silence between them was different now. It wasn't a wall, it was an invitation. "I want to help," she said. "I know. I mean it, Jackson, not just words. Then help me take Ellie to the clinic tomorrow." Claire reached for his hand. "Of course." The next morning, they drove in silence. Ellie sat between them, holding Jackson's arm with quiet strength. The clinic was in a neighboring town, cleaner and brighter than Jackson expected. The staff was kind. The wait was long. They took blood, ran scans, asked questions. Nothing was urgent, they said again, but it could become serious without attention. Jackson sat beside Claire in the waiting room, his head in his hands. "I can't lose her," he said. "She's everything." "You won't." He looked at her, eyes tired. "I don't have the money." She didn't offer to pay, not yet. She knew he wouldn't take it. Instead, she said, "Then we find a way." By the time they left the clinic, the sun was low in the sky. Jackson drove home with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Ellie's leg. Claire stared out the window, lost in thought. At the garage the next day, they found a camera crew setting up across the street, and still Claire didn't leave. Neither did Jackson. The fight had begun. The first camera appeared across the street. Then came another, this time with a boom mic and a woman holding a clipboard, walking back and forth on the sidewalk, eyeing the garage with the feigned casualness of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. By noon, 2 reporters stood by the diner entrance, holding coffee cups, pretending to blend in. But Glen Ridge wasn't a place where people blended in. Everyone noticed. Jackson kept working, trying to ignore the whispers. Claire stayed inside for most of the day, watching from the shadows of the office window. Ellie, sensing the shift, said less, clung more, and stayed close to Claire's side. The air in the shop had changed. Where there had been calm, now there was pressure. Where there had been quiet, now there was the low thrum of something approaching. The first story broke online that night, not in a major outlet, but a well-read blog that specialized in corporate gossip. The headline read, "Heiress Mechanic, Claire Bennett found hiding out in small Texas town." The accompanying photo had been taken from across the street. Claire at the garage, handing a wrench to Jackson, her expression caught between concentration and fatigue. The article painted her as unstable, possibly mentally unfit to lead, suggesting a mysterious man, Jackson, might be manipulating her, shielding her from her duties. Jackson read it in silence. Then he reread it. He didn't speak until Claire came into the room, phone already in hand. "You saw it?" she asked. He nodded. "They're spinning the narrative now. Harder, faster, just like I knew they would." Ellie had gone to sleep an hour earlier. The house was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. Jackson finally spoke. "Why you?" Claire sat down, her body folding inward. "Because I refused to play their game. Because I inherited something I wasn't supposed to. My father built the company himself, but the board always expected someone more controllable. They smiled when he named me successor, but the moment he died, they began preparing to replace me. I lasted a year. I worked twice as hard to prove I belonged. But when I started questioning practices, backdoor deals, bonuses, slashed pensions, I became a threat. So they waited. They waited until I was exhausted, isolated. I was grieving, burned out, and too proud to ask for help. so I left. And now they're using that break as evidence, claiming I'm unfit, that I disappeared without warning, that I've abandoned everything. Jackson looked at her. Did you? She met his gaze without blinking, fighting in the first place. No, I just needed to breathe, to remember why I was. He nodded slowly. Then, maybe it's time you told your side. Claire stood and paced the room. Ellie, they'll twist everything. If I go public, they'll dig deeper. They'll come after you. After they already are. Claire stopped. You don't understand what these people are capable of. Jackson rose, steady and certain. Then teach me, but don't let them win by staying quiet. The following morning, Claire walked into the garage with a different posture. Not defensive, not hidden, composed, resolved. She wore jeans and a white blouse, her hair pulled back simply. She called Ruth and asked to use the back room of the diner. She called a contact from her old PR team, someone she once trusted. And then she called a journalist. Not one of the tabloid hounds, but a real reporter. Someone who had covered her father's early work. Someone who had once written about the company with reverence and honesty. That afternoon, Claire gave her first and only interview. It was filmed with one camera, no lighting setup, no makeup artist. Just Claire, seated at a plain wooden table, her hands folded, voice steady. She told the truth, all of it. She spoke about the pressure, the betrayals, the fear. She admitted her absence, but reframed it. Not as a breakdown, but as a moment of clarity. She described finding Glenridge, Jackson, Ellie. She never used their last names, never shared more than necessary, but her gratitude for the place and for the man who had offered her safety without judgment was unmistakable. By evening, the interview was live. Within hours, it spread. Claire didn't watch the reactions. She stayed in the garage, wiping down surfaces that didn't need cleaning. Jackson joined her, neither of them speaking much, but there was a shift in the town. People came by to nod in support. A few left small notes. Ruth brought food without asking. Even the sheriff stopped in, just to say, "Let us know if you need anything." That night, Jackson found Claire on the front porch. She sat alone, legs pulled up to her chest, staring at the stars. "You did it," he said. "No," she replied softly. "I just stopped hiding." He sat beside her. "It's enough." She leaned against his shoulder. "What if it's not? Then we keep going." The next morning, the garage was quiet again. The reporters had left. The cameras were gone. In their place were letters, handwritten ones, some from former employees, others from strangers. People who had watched the interview and recognized pieces of themselves in her story. Jackson read a few, then handed one to Claire. It was from a woman in Oklahoma who had worked at one of the company's smaller plants before it was shut down. She thanked Claire for speaking up, for not pretending everything was fine, for reminding her what leadership looked like. Claire read it twice. Later that day, she pulled Jackson aside. "I need to go back," she said. He didn't look surprised. "I know. They'll come after me harder now, but I can't. Let them win. Not after this. What do you need?" "You." He nodded. Not long after, she stepped into the garage office and opened her laptop. It was the first time she'd touched it since arriving in Glenridge. She logged into her company account. Her name was still there, barely. The board hadn't yet voted. She had time. And now, she had a plan. The morning after the interview aired, Claire's name was everywhere. Not just in the gossip blogs or investor forums, but in real publications, business columns, think pieces, even mainstream news. The tone had shifted. What was once speculation laced with judgment now carried a different energy. Curiosity, empathy, even admiration. Still, the war wasn't over. The board hadn't rescinded its threat. They remained quiet, calculating, waiting to see if the storm would settle or if Claire's return would fan it into something bigger. At the garage, life resumed its rhythm, but with a quieter intensity. Jackson noticed how often Claire checked her email now, how her phone buzzed more than ever. But she never disappeared into those devices. She remained present, with Ellie, with the work, with him. Every glance, between them felt more charged, every conversation layered with the knowledge that their time like this was nearing a turning point. Then came the call. It wasn't from a board member or a lawyer or even Marcus. It was from someone Claire hadn't heard from in nearly a decade, Gregory Dalton, a retired executive and one of her father's oldest allies. He had left the company before the infighting began, disillusioned by the direction it had taken. "I watched the interview," he said simply. "You reminded me of your father, not the man who sat in boardrooms, but the one who spent his Saturdays walking the factory floor." Claire stood by the open garage door, phone pressed to her ear, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Thank you, Gregory. That means more than you know." "I'm coming out of retirement," he said. "Session." "They're expecting you to join remotely. To stand with you, I've called a meeting. Emergency when?" "Tomorrow, noon." Claire lowered the phone slowly after the call ended. Jackson, who had been working on the Mustang again, a task he now took his time with, looked over at her. "Trouble?" "Possibly the opposite," she said. "They want me back." He wiped his hands and crossed the floor. "You ready?" "I think so." He studied her face. "You don't sound convinced." Claire took a deep breath. "Because going back means more than just taking a position. It means stepping into the fire and bringing others with me. Including you." Jackson frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him fully. "Want to build something. With you. I want to invest in this place. Not as a charity. Not to bail you out." Jackson looked stunned. "Claire, let me finish," she said gently. "I've been thinking about it for days. You've built more than a garage here. You've built trust, integrity, a space where people still believe in honest work, and that's rare. I want to take this model, this exact way of doing things, and expand it. Not into some flashy chain, not franchises, something else. Community garages, fair wages, local ownership. A network based on values, not volume." He stared at her, silent. "You don't have to say yes," she added. "But I believe in this. And I believe in you." He took a long breath, running a hand through his hair. "Card in my name. That I've never worked for anyone but myself? You know, I've never even had a credit." "This isn't about you working for me," she said. "It's about building something together." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped outside and looked at the sky. It was the kind of cloudless blue that made everything feel momentarily possible. Claire followed, her footsteps quiet behind him. "I don't want to lose what I've got," he said. "Then don't," she replied. "This isn't a replacement, it's a foundation." He turned to her. "It's a lot to ask." "I know." He looked past her toward the shop, where Ellie sat in the doorway drawing with chalk, the child he'd raised through every hardship now smiling, as if the world hadn't cracked open just days before. He thought of Hannah, of how she'd once believed they could create something lasting in a place no one noticed. "Let me think about it," he said at last. "Take all the time you need," Claire replied. But time was running short. The next day she would step back into the corporate world, virtually, yes, but completely. And whatever came next would determine everything. That night, Jackson didn't sleep. He sat at the table with a legal pad and a pen, listing out the pros and cons like a man trying to measure a future that wouldn't fit on paper. He thought of his father's voice, gruff and tired, telling him to never get mixed up with business partners. He thought of Ellie, who deserved more than nights filled with stress and silence. And he thought of Claire, not as the woman on the news, but the woman who had made his daughter laugh again, who had listened without judging, who had offered something bold and terrifying, not for pity, but for potential. When morning came, he was still at the table. Claire was already dressed, seated in the back room of the garage with her laptop open. Jackson knocked on the frame before stepping inside. "They're all here," she said. "The board, Gregory, even Marcus." He nodded. "Before you start, I have an answer." She turned, hope flickering behind her eyes. "Yes," he said. "Up alone. But not because I'm scared of losing this place, because I'm tired of holding it." She exhaled, visibly relieved. "Let's build it," he said. "One shop at a time." Then she clicked Join Meeting. The video call began with a mosaic of expressionless faces. Each board member sat in their corner of the screen like chess pieces locked in place, some in high-rise offices, others in carefully curated home libraries meant to project authority. Gregory Dalton opened the meeting, his voice firm, almost ceremonial, as he introduced Claire Bennett back to the room she had once commanded. Claire sat upright, her background intentionally simple. A plain wall behind her, a single photo of her father on the shelf to her left. She wore no jewelry, no excessive makeup, only a quiet steadiness that silenced the initial murmurs. Her tone was measured, her words calculated not to please but to reframe. She acknowledged her absence without apology, outlined the reasons that had led her to step away, and exposed with delicate precision the systemic issues she had unearthed in the months leading up to her departure. What was meant to be a return felt more like a reckoning. Jackson sat just outside the frame of the call watching her. He couldn't hear every word, but he read the shift in Claire's shoulders, the way she leaned into the silence that followed. Each point, not fearing it but owning it. He saw the flickers of emotion she didn't show in public, the tension at the corners of her eyes, the brief pause in her breath when certain names were mentioned. He knew she was doing more than reclaiming a title. She was dismantling the illusion they had built around her. And then Marcus spoke. Until that moment, he had remained quiet, a non-participant, his name barely uttered. But now, his voice broke through the call, like a blade through paper. "Your story is compelling, Claire," he began, "but stories don't replace facts. And the fact remains you abandoned your post, without communication, without a succession plan. In doing so, you jeopardized the stability of our leadership and cost shareholders significant confidence." Claire didn't blink. "And what about the bonuses you approved in my name? The layoffs you disguised as restructuring while I was away? The contract rewrites with offshore suppliers, all signed using my digital authorization, which I had revoked?" There was a pause. One of the other board members shifted uncomfortably. Marcus leaned forward, had been clearer. "Those documents were filed during your tenure. If your communication, I submitted my temporary leave request, and I have copies of every digital transmission logged before my departure. So let me be very clear, Marcus. You don't get to rewrite my absence into betrayal. You don't get to weaponize grief." For a moment there was silence. Then Marcus smirked. "Even if you're telling the truth, what do you plan to do? Return to the boardroom and carry on like nothing happened? Rebuild your reputation from a garage in, say, the middle of nowhere?" Claire didn't flinch. "No, I'm going to rebuild it from where truth lives, from where work still means something, and I'm not doing it alone." She clicked a button and a new participant entered the call. Gregory introduced him quickly, a regional investor who had watched the interview and decided to back Claire's vision. A second name appeared soon after, then a third. Jackson watched as one by one, the empty slots filled with people who didn't speak for prestige, but for purpose. Former employees, union reps, industry advocates. Claire had brought more than her voice to the table. She had brought witnesses. The board listened, some begrudgingly, others attentively. Marcus leaned back, arms crossed, but his confidence had begun to crack. After nearly 2 hours, the meeting ended with no final vote, but with a promise, a full review of board activity, a hold on any interim leadership changes, and an audit of contracts signed during Claire's absence. It was a pause in the storm, not a victory, but a moment to breathe. When Claire logged off, Jackson handed her a bottle of water. She accepted it with a shaky smile. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said. Claire exhaled. "It's not over." "No," Jackson said. "But now they know you're not alone." But Marcus wasn't finished. That same evening, a new article appeared. This one came from a major outlet, disguised as balanced reporting but laced with venom. It included details no one should have known: her exact location, the name of Jackson's garage, even Ellie's school. They hadn't just questioned her fitness, they had gone after her sanctuary. Claire stood in front of the article with her jaw tight, fists clenched. "They're sending a message," she said. Jackson took the phone from her hands. Then let's answer it. The next day, a camera crew pulled into the garage lot, but this time it had been invited. Claire stood beside Jackson, not to defend herself, but to launch something new. She spoke about her next step, an initiative rooted in trust and sustainability. A national network of ethical auto repair centers starting right there in Glenridge. She named it Miller and Bennett Motors. And she wasn't asking for investment. She was offering partnership. The response was immediate. The story shifted again. Not from pity or scandals, but from hope. Headlines spoke of innovation, of values returning to American business, of a woman who had redefined legacy by choosing integrity over influence. But Marcus didn't fade. He filed a formal suit the following week, claiming breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized disclosure of corporate information, and defamation. It was a desperate move, but one with weight. Claire read the complaint silently. Then she folded it and handed it to Jackson. "Let him try," she said. "I'm not scared of him anymore." And she meant it. That night they stood on the back steps of the garage, Ellie asleep inside, the town wrapped in the hush of late hours. Claire leaned into Jackson's shoulder. "You know this could still ruin me." He shook his head. "No, it's already made you." In the weeks that followed the lawsuit, the tension that had once consumed the garage began to shift. It didn't disappear. The legal pressure was real, and the media attention still lingered at the edges of Claire's world. But something more enduring had begun to take root. For the first time in what felt like years, Claire wasn't living reactively. She was building something, as not alone and not in theory, but on solid ground, with real hands, real tools, and real stakes. Jackson had taken to calling the new corner of the shop the Blueprint Zone. Claire claimed a stretch of counter space beside the storage racks and covered it in drafts, supplier lists, marketing strategies, and budget estimates. She still dressed plainly, still tied her hair back without flair, but her presence no longer carried the heaviness of someone on the run. Instead, there was purpose in her steps, clarity in her words. Jackson had seen her powerful before, but never grounded. Like this, it was as if the truth of who she was had finally settled into her bones. The first official announcement came 3 weeks after the interview, the launch of Miller and Bennett Motors, beginning with the Glenridge location as the flagship. There would be 4 additional centers within the first year, all of them anchored. In towns like theirs, places often left behind by larger corporations, but rich in skill, tradition, and community loyalty. Claire's business plan wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about restoring dignity to a trade long undervalued. She spoke of fair wages, career training, mentorship programs, and a culture of respect. Word spread quickly. Applications poured in from mechanics across the country. Veterans of the trade, new graduates, women and men who had grown tired of being treated as replaceable. The response stunned even Claire. Jackson, however, wasn't surprised. He had always known there was something powerful in building a place where people felt they mattered. One morning, as the town prepared for the official reopening of the garage under its new name, Ellie stood in the middle of the shop with a brush in her hand, covered in streaks of navy blue paint. The fresh sign above the door read, "Miller and Bennett Motors." The old one, cracked, sun-faded, had been preserved and mounted on the sidewall, a tribute to where it all began. Claire watched Ellie paint with a soft smile, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. "She insists on helping with everything," she said. "She's proud," Jackson replied. "She's seen it all happen. She's braver than most adults I know. She gets that from her mother." Claire looked at him then, her smile holding more weight. "And from you." The reopening was quiet, not a flashy event with streamers and speeches, but a gathering of locals, people who had supported the garage through hard years, neighbors who had brought casseroles during the foreclosure scare, and friends who had never stopped believing in Jackson. There were no photographers, no reporters, just laughter, shared meals, stories passed from one table to another. Claire gave a brief thank you. Jackson said even less, but it was enough. The community didn't need grandeur, they needed to feel included, and they were. By the end of The first of the new team members arrived. A father and daughter duo from Tennessee, a retired Air Force mechanic from Arizona, and a young woman who had left a franchise chain in Houston because, as she put it, she wanted to work somewhere where quality meant more than speed. Jackson oversaw the garage operations just as he always had, but now he wasn't doing it alone. Claire focused on strategy, partnerships, and managing the gradual rollout of the next locations. Ellie kept her spot in the corner office, renamed Ellie's Corner, complete with a small desk and shelves for her art supplies. Every new employee was introduced to her as the real boss. The lawsuit from Marcus dragged on, but it lost momentum. Public sentiment leaned heavily in Claire's favor, and the investigation she initiated into mismanagement practices yielded enough evidence to not only discredit Marcus's claims, but also implicate him in multiple counts of financial misconduct. The board, under mounting pressure, reached a settlement agreement. Claire would retain her title as founding executive of the new branch entity, independent from the former corporation, and all legal disputes would be closed. She didn't celebrate the moment with champagne or headlines. Instead, she returned to the garage that evening, took off her blazer, pulled on an apron, and helped Jackson change the oil on a customer's old pickup. "I thought you hated this part," he joked. "I do," she replied, "but I love what it represents." They worked in silence, side by side, the way they always had. No need for ceremony, just presence. Later, when Ellie came out to say goodnight, Claire bent down to kiss her forehead, then watched as she disappeared into the house. "Do you ever think we're just living in the calm between storms?" she asked Jackson. "Maybe," he said, "but not all storms come to destroy. Some just clear the path." By the following month, construction had begun on the second location, in a town 2 hours north. Jackson visited on weekends, training the new team. Claire stayed behind to manage Glenridge. They coordinated constantly, but the trust between them had grown so instinctive that words were often unnecessary. Their partnership, forged in crisis, had become something more resilient, a living thing they both protected. One afternoon, as Claire updated a vendor list, Ellie sat beside her coloring. "Will I always live here?" Ellie asked. Claire paused. "Do you want to?" Ellie thought for a second. "I think so. It feels like we belong here." Claire didn't answer right away. She looked across the garage where Jackson worked, sleeves rolled up, humming quietly to himself. Then she looked back at Ellie. "So do I," she whispered. That evening, the sun set behind the garage, casting long shadows over the fresh paint and the new sign above the door. The wind carried the smell of oil and sawdust, mixed with blooming sage from the lot across the road. The sounds of laughter floated from inside, mechanics sharing stories, Jackson telling Ellie about the first car he ever fixed, Claire updating the payroll software. There was no grand finale, no singular moment of triumph. Only this, a key. Life rebuilt not through force but through choice. A future forged from patience, honesty, and the quiet bravery of staying when it would have been easier to run. The second Miller and Bennett Motors location opened quietly in the small town of Redfield, a place much like Glen Ridge, overlooked by big business, rich in hard work and small miracles. Jackson had spent several weekends on site, helping set up the equipment, guiding the new mechanics through the rhythms of a customer-first shop, and insisting that no one ever cut corners, not even when the day ran long. The grand opening had no ribbon cutting or celebrity endorsements. Instead, there were coffee pots brewing behind the counter, a local band playing on the sidewalk, and neighbors bringing baked goods to celebrate something that felt like theirs. Claire arrived the night before, driving herself as she always. Did now the Mustang finally restored, but no longer a symbol of escape. It had become something else, not a reminder of the past, but a witness to what had been built from it. She walked into the shop where Jackson stood beneath a lift, oil on his hands, a smudge on his cheek. He turned at the sound of her footsteps and smiled in the quiet way he always did when he saw her after time apart. "Everything ready?" she asked. He nodded. "Looks like it. No fires to put out." "Not yet, but we're still a few hours from sunrise." They laughed, then fell into the easy silence that had become their language. By the end of the month, they had already signed plans for a third garage. It would be further out, almost a day's drive, in a town nestled between low hills and long stretches of farmland. Claire had chosen it for the same reason she chose everything now, not because it promised profit, but because it needed what they could offer. She had become someone who no longer measured success in press releases or quarterly earnings. Her metrics were different now. Employees who smiled at the end of the day, customers who returned not because they had to, but because they wanted to, and partners who built with their hands and their hearts. Jackson didn't speak much during business meetings. He didn't need to. His presence was a statement on its own. He represented the core of what they had become, not polished, not scripted, but undeniably real. Wherever he went, people listened. They trusted him because he didn't ask them to. He just did the work. Ellie, now 10, had begun her own kind of apprenticeship. She knew how to change a tire, check oil levels, and identify parts from memory, but her talents extended beyond the shop. She had taken over the bulletin board near the front desk at the Glenridge location, where she posted thank you notes, photos of customers with their vehicles, drawings of cars with wings and engines that roared like dragons. She named it the Wall of Joy. Claire offered to digitize it once. Ellie refused. "Paper feels better," she said, and that was that. One late afternoon, as the sun hung low over Glenridge, Jackson found Claire on the back steps of the house, her shoes off, her feet in the grass. She held a glass of iced tea, her hair loose, eyes tracking a hawk circling high above the open field. He sat beside her. "You look like someone who's finally breathing." "I am," she said. "It took longer than I thought." "You stayed long enough to see it through." She looked at him. "You know I never meant to. I was supposed to be here for 2 days. I remember. But then you showed up with decency and an engine manual, and somehow everything changed." He chuckled. "I think Ellie had more to do with it." Claire reached for his hand. "Was. She reminded me who I could be. You reminded me who I already." For a while they sat in silence. There was no urgency anymore, no pressure to decide, defend, or run. Just a stretch of land behind them, a shop that bore their names, and a life that had become something worth staying for. That night, Claire stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, brushing her hair slowly. The scars of her old life were still there, not on her skin, but in the weight of her gaze, in the caution that never fully left her voice. But now they were countered by something new, not innocence, that was gone, but grace, experience, without bitterness, strength without armor. She joined Jackson outside under the stars, where he had set up a small fire pit. Ellie was already there, roasting marshmallows and telling a story she had made up on the spot about a Mustang that could talk. Claire listened with laughter in her eyes, and Jackson watched them both with a fullness he hadn't felt since before Hannah passed. It wasn't the same kind of love. It never could be. But it was just as real, just as deep, and in many ways more earned. Eventually, Ellie yawned and leaned her head on Claire's shoulder. "You're not leaving again, right?" "No," Claire whispered. "Not unless you kick me out." "Never," Ellie murmured, already half asleep. Jackson looked at Claire across the fire. "You ever think about what comes next?" She met his gaze. "Every day. And for once it doesn't scare me." They sat there long after the fire burned down to glowing embers. No plans were made, no vows exchanged, no promises carved into stone. Just the quiet understanding that they were no longer building alone, that whatever came next, more garages, more battles, more storms, they would meet it together. The next morning, Claire rose early and stepped into the garage before sunrise. The scent of steel and oil greeted her like an old friend. She turned on the lights one by one, illuminating the space that had somehow become the foundation of everything she had rebuilt. Moments later, Jackson joined her, coffee in hand, a smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. "You opening the place without me now?" he asked. "Just getting a head start," she replied. He passed her the coffee. She took a sip, then looked around at the garage. Their garage. Every bolt, every beam, Every faded mark on the floor spoke of work. Done the hard way, honest, unrelenting, real. Ellie appeared in the doorway, sleepy but smiling. She wore a sweatshirt with the garage logo printed on it, her design. She held a clipboard and announced, "First appointments at 8. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Since when are you running scheduling?" "Since now," Ellie said, stepping inside. Jackson and Claire exchanged a look. "Guess she's the real boss now," Jackson muttered. "She always was," Claire replied. Together the three of them stood in the glow of early light, ready for another day. Not just of work, but of continuing a life they had chosen. Built not from escape but from resilience. Not from wealth but from worth, not alone but together.